Welcome back to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we have a game between Tania Sachdev of India and Anna Sargsyan from Armenia. In this game, which was played in the year 2021, Tania Sachdev was rated 2392, and Anna Sargsyan was rated 2402, and Tania had the white pieces. She began with d4, knight f6, c4, g6. Now here, she plays a cunning move. Tania Sachdev plays the move f3. Now, in a normal, say, King's Indian or Gruenfeld, let's say, knight to c3, d5, pawn takes, knight takes, e4, knight c3, bc3. This would be the standard Gruenfeld mainline variation. And you'll notice in this position, Black has succeeded at exchanging a pair of minor pieces and is prepared after bishop to g7 to attack White's center. Moves like c5, knight to c6 are in the offing. So the idea behind f3 is to do the same basic thing but avoid the exchange of knights. So, for example, d5 takes, now you play e4, kick the knight away, and the knight goes to c3. The only issue for White, and it's only an issue if it's an issue, is that if Black decides to go ahead and play the King's Indian defense instead, White is committed to a Zamish King's Indian. So you have to be prepared to play the Zamish against the King's Indian when you play f3 at move 3 here. So Tania plays f3, and then Anna does play d5, pawn takes, knight to c3. So we have our starting position, bishop g7, Black attacks d4 twice, bishop e3, defending d4 twice, the queen and the bishop at e3 defend it. So White's basic attacking plan here, if left to their own designs, is to play queen to d2, exchange the dark squared bishops off at h6, play h4, h5, open the h-file. A very standard attacking formation. We see this in a Dragon Sicilian Yugoslav attack, for example. Perhaps you've seen this way of attacking before. Anna castles, Tania plays queen to d2, knight c6, attacking d4 again. Long castles, adds the defending rook at d1, e5. Going right after that d4 square. Now, there's a move here that White has to be very careful about. It's a blunder, but it's a natural move. That would be the move knight g to e2, adding another defender to the d4 square. That seems like a natural move, but it runs into knight to c4, which forks the queen at d2 and the bishop on e3, and Black would get the dark squared bishop, and in fact is actually just winning after this move. So White does have to be a bit careful. Tania, of course, does not fall into that and plays the move d5 here, advancing in the center. Her opponent, Anna, decides to jump into the middle with her knight. Knight to d4. And the knight is centralized and well placed, but the knight is a little unstable. And Tania Sachdev immediately begins to undermine that knight with the move f4, putting pressure on the e5 pawn, so the knight is shaky. It's well placed, but very shaky. Anna plays c5, further defending that knight. She knows she'll need to do that. Pawn takes. If White takes en passant and after knight to c6, Black is perfectly fine in this position. Pawn takes, and now an intermediate move before capturing on e5, bishop to g4, hitting the rook at d1. The rook moves, and only now, bishop takes e5. h3, Tania wants to kick that bishop at g4 away. Queen to h4. Anna says, not so fast. I want that bishop to stay right where it is. So queen to h4 pins the h3 pawn to the rook. So if pawn were to take the bishop, the queen would take the rook. Bishop goes to d3, beginning to clear off the back rank. And here, Anna sort of admits that the bishop's too unstable on g4, and she moves it back. Another alternative is rook a to c8. But then after a possible sequence of moves, bishop g5, queen to h5, king to b1, and then if the bishop goes back, knight g to e2, and white is already threatening g4 winning material. So she goes back to d7 immediately. Knight to f3 attacks the queen at h4 and puts pressure on the knight at d4. So black exchanges. Pawn takes knight. Now Tania Sachdev is clearly better. We can see she has a very, very strong set of pawns in the center of the board. And also the bishop can still go to g5 and harass and annoy black's queen. So white is definitely better here. So the queen retreats to e7 and then f4. Now this is the game's novelty. The first brand new move that was played in this game. Every other move in this game had been played at least in one other game up to this point in time. And what Tania Sachdev wants to do is basically just advance that nice central phalanx of pawns, move it forward, and just consume space in the center of the board. She does it now with tempo by threatening the bishop on e5 with the pawn. The bishop has to retreat. She plays king to b1, always a good move to play when you're castled on the queen side, getting that king away from any pressure. Knight goes to a4. The knight hits c3. The bishop at g7 hits c3, so the knight really has to exchange itself for the other knight. Bishop takes a4. Now here black has almost no pressure on white's center, and Tania Sachdev continues to expand that central structure. e5. Rook a to c8 with the threat of c4 hitting the bishop on d3, then c3, opening up some lines against white's king. So Tania immediately plays rook to c1, controls the c4 square so the pawn cannot advance, and also attacks the pawn with the bishop at e3 and the rook. b6 to make that pawn more stable. Now h4. Now she's beginning to march the h-pawn forward. She wants to open the h-file, and that combined with those central pawns is really tough. Queen to b7, attacking the e5 pawn. Bishop to e4, defending the e5 pawn. f6, hoping in some way to undermine that center or to get it to advance so that it creates weak squares that can be blockaded. And Tania Sachdev says, I'm not worried about that. I'm not even worried about losing my e5 pawn. I just want to open up those lines of attack. She plays h5 to open up the h-file. Pawn takes, hg6, ef4, bishop f4, queen e7, attacking the bishop on e4, and Tania plays rook to c4. It defends the bishop on e4 and also attacks black's bishop on a4. And if black tries to get out of this by playing b5 and kick the rook away, then d6 is played. And after, say, queen to f6, queen to d5, check. And a piece would have to interpose and be lost because if black played king to h7, king to h8, excuse me, then rook to h7 would be mate. So after rook to c4, b5 does not work. She retreats her bishop to d7. Now, queen to h2. Nothing subtle about that. Attacking at the h7 square and threatening checkmate. Rook takes f4. Now, white has to be a little careful. She can't just plow through and try to mate immediately with queen h7, because after king to f8, black is actually winning. There are no more mate threats, and black has won the piece. So white does have to go ahead and take the rook, but it's still an exchange. It's still a large amount of material. Rook f8 hitting the queen, and now queen h4, threatening mate on h7, but also offering the exchange of queens from the queen at e7. So black has to exchange queens, otherwise it's going to be mate. There is an attempt at a trick, which is rook to f1 check, trying to draw the rook away from h1, but it's easily parried with rook to c1, and after rook c1 you retake with the king, and all is well for white. So queen takes h4, gh7 check first before recapturing the queen, and king to h8. Now this is an important idea. That pawn at h7 is an incredible problem for black. Not only is it one square away from queening, but it makes it so that the black king is occupied with dealing with that pawn. And it can't activate itself in the endgame. As you know, in an endgame with queens off the board, the king will often become an attacking piece. And now black's king cannot enter the game. Rook takes h4, bishop to d4, hoping to interfere with the bishop and rook. a3, bishop b5, hitting the rook. Rook to c2, bishop a4, rook to g2, bishop to g7, rook to h1, covering the back rank. Rook to f7, trying to create a barrier so that the d pawn can't pass, and queen. d6, rook to d7. Now bishop to f5, hits the rook at d7, and Anna goes ahead and takes the pawn at d6, but that doesn't work. After rook to g7, she resigns, and Tania Sachdev wins the game. Why? Well, if the king takes the rook, then white just promotes and queens. King to f7 is forced, and rook to h7 is mate. A really nice attacking game from Tania Sachdev. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.